Well, Huib is gone now, but thank you, Huib, for the introduction and also for the invitation. It's rather special to be here. Around 10 years ago, I was working with Henk van Houten in this department. It was my first job after graduation, so it's nice to be here and open the academic year with you. So in this lecture, I would like to talk about the mediatization of the city. And I would like to start with this image. It's a famous picture by the Belgian painter René Magritte. It's called the tragedy of images. The French caption translates as, "This is not a pipe." Indeed, it is not a pipe. It is an image of a pipe. Similarly, this is not a city. It is an image of a city. It is, we should add, a specific type of image. It's the image on Ed Glaeser's book, The Triumph of the City, which celebrates cities as humankind's greatest invention and proposes that cities make us richer, smarter, greener, healthier, and happier. Similarly, this is not a city. It is a representation of a city. It adorns the cover of Mike Davis' Planet of Slums and visually conveys the book's message that the world's slums are growing at great speed and provide little to their residents in terms of security or comfort. Two books, two discourses on the city, two different images. Images clearly are not innocent representations, but reflect and shape our perceptions of cities. So this insight seems trivial, perhaps even banal. But I would argue that its implications for urban studies are profound. When we say we study cities, what we often mean is that we study representations of cities. And we study cities with representations by visualizing, enumerating, and narrating them. I'm not making the claim that cities have no materiality or that visceral experiences do not matter. But to grasp and acknowledge these tangible aspects of urban life, we by necessity have to transform them into representations. We have to capture cities in numbers, images, words, to grasp them intellectually and to make practical interventions. It is therefore of the utmost importance to understand not just how cities are created and experienced, but also how cities are perceived and represented. In fact, the very distinction between representation and practice is problematic, as the two are all too often indistinguishable. Consider tourism experiences. When we visit the city, we typically first read through websites and other sources to get an idea of the places we want to visit. We look up restaurants and hotels, read reviews, look at pictures. And once arrived on location, we navigate through Google Maps, which selectively highlights some places and attractions. Our experience of the city is simultaneously the experience of its manifold representations. I experienced this myself, for instance, when I visited New York. The moment I came out of the subway, I heard the sirens I had so often heard before in the background of detective shows. And I saw the skyscrapers and traffic flows I had seen so often before, in pictures or in movies. I experienced New York for the first time, but I had been cued for almost my entire life to observe and sense what I was about to observe and sense. I had learned exactly what to see and feel, and the actual experience was not a moment of alienation, but one of fulfillment. The task to understand representations of cities is especially urgent given the intensity of mediatization. We increasingly perceive the city through our smartphones, tablets, and computers, as we browse the news and share stories and pictures through social media. So this is what I want to focus on in this lecture. How does mediatization shape and reshape urban life? Language conventions push me to express the question in this way, but I do want to note a problematic assumption implied by the question, namely that mediatization is external to urban life and acts on it. That is what linguistic convention dictates. So I will start with this inquiry, with this unfortunate distinction, and then hopefully demonstrate in the course of the lecture how the media are implicated in urban life and how urban life is implicated in media. So, what do I mean by mediatization? A basic definition would be that mediatization occurs when practices are increasingly oriented to the media. So this can mean that people watch their screens. It can also mean that they stage their performances in anticipation of their coverage in the media. And it can mean that people increasingly structure their practices in response to media representations. So mediatization is obviously complex and multifaceted. And in the course of this talk, I will try to highlight the various ways for which the media and social media reconfigure our relation to the cities. But rather than trying to cover all the complexities in advance, let me proceed with a case study that impressed on me the need to consider how the media is implicated in cities. The case study was part of a research project I did with Amy Jane Giele at the University of Amsterdam a number of years ago. We carried out this research in the aftermath of Theo van Gogh's murder. To refresh your memory, a Muslim extremist, Mohammed Bouyeri, had brutally murdered Theo van Gogh in 2004 after Van Gogh had made a movie, Submission, a movie that argued that the Quran sanctions the suppression and abuse of women. The murder was not the first incident that put the spotlight on Muslim extremism, but it was certainly the most dramatic. In the days and weeks after the murder, there were attacks on mosques and Muslim schools. Many politicians feared that multicultural tensions that had been simmering below the surface would now erupt. It was in this context that we became interested in De Baarsjes, a multicultural neighborhood in the west of Amsterdam. This particular neighborhood had been in the spotlight on several occasions before. Politicians and civil society organizations had been working together to improve relations among the different population groups. For instance, after Moroccan youth had disturbed the May 5 commemoration of the Second World War, the neighborhood council and civil society organizations organized a football match between Moroccans and Jews, which was widely covered in the media. And the year after, the May 5 commemoration involved people from many different ethnic and religious backgrounds. And again, the media were present and they celebrated this commemoration. So these types of activities are not only meant to improve community relations within the neighborhood. So here's one administrator talking about how he sees the neighborhood as a stage to reach distant audiences. You can think, he says, it's just a neighborhood. But there are phenomena on all kinds of levels. The family, the street, education, health, the city, the world, and all that comes together in this one neighborhood. So if you want to be a player in that game, you have to use the media. I think that the government should use the media. The media also like to be used, because there's a wonderful possibility for teamwork. The media wants a story and we have the story. We give the story, but it is not finished. There are many risks. So here we see how the neighborhood becomes a stage for media performances. As the government orients itself to the media, it reorganizes itself. In the words of Van Gils, this administrator, it means that the government has to tell a story, and it has to be a particular type of story. There have to be cliffhangers, otherwise the media are not interested. The government's communication advisor is more explicit about this. She felt that the government of De Baarsjes had to come up with something exciting in response to the murder of Theo van Gogh. This is how she describes what needs to be done. It has to bite your brain, otherwise it will not stick. Those are the terms in which we, the communication people, think. Make something visible, put it on the stage, and then it will be remembered. And for that to happen, it always has to bite a little. Intention to agreement, no, that's all nothing. It has to say boom. And when it says boom, the other says ouch. So this is, I think, a remarkable quote, not least because it's so honest. The communication advisor is frank that good stories go boom, that they bite a little, and that they therefore hurt a little. She and the administrators came up with the idea for a contract with society. The masks in the neighborhood would sign a contract that would commit them to the struggle against radicalism. They would do so in the eyes of the national media to convey the message that the masks were taking their responsibility. As it turned out, only one of the 3 masks in the neighborhood was interested to cooperate with this plan. This was a Turkish mask that had already been working with the government for a long time, and it had profiled itself as a progressive vanguard among Muslims in the Netherlands. And this was one of the reasons why this particular mask had won government support to build a very large new building. So they were eager to participate in media performances and solidify their coalition with the government. The 2 other masks in the neighborhood were less enthusiastic. A Moroccan mask opposed the contract. One representative stated, "I think the contract sends out the wrong signal because you confirm that the masks are a factor in the problems around the assassination of Theo van Gogh. So you confirm the prejudice that we, as a mask association, try to counter." The media and the government nevertheless pressured the mask to sign, hinting that the government would treat the mask more favorably if it agreed, and less favorably if it didn't. While politicians and representatives of the Turkish mask featured in newspapers and on television as staunch defenders of liberal democracy, the other masks were on the defensive, as their lack of interest in the contract was framed as a sign of bad faith. Now, interestingly, the contract was not in response to anything that had happened in the neighborhood. This is not where Van Gogh was murdered. It is also not where his murderer lived. It is not where Van Gogh lived. In fact, as one of the administrators explained, there was no direct cause to think that something was going on in the masks. But a lot of people in the Netherlands had the idea that the next bomber was being recruited in the mask. So what we see here is that the government invented the contract not because it observed radicalism in the neighborhood, but because it sensed that there was a demand among media audiences for dramatic images and narratives of the struggle against radicalism. Referring back to Magritte's painting, we might say that this is not a policy against radicalism, but a representation of a policy against radicalism. We might go further and say it's a mirage, an apparent reflection. So what can we infer from this particular case? We cannot think of the media as simply representing what goes on in society. The media change the logic through which cities and communities are governed. In this case, the government deliberately organized its relations with civil society so that they would become mediagenic. Certain types of deliberation were excluded from the repertoire. The government, for instance, did not want to engage in open-ended dialogue, nor did it want to make an inventory of concerns. No, to repeat the communication advisor I cited earlier, it wanted to have a story that could be put on a stage and that could go boom. Consequently, when urban politics mediatizes, it is staged and performed as a drama, with heroes and anti-heroes, cliffhangers and plots. This is, of course, a peculiar case, but I think that similar dynamics can be observed in many other cases, and I invite you to think about examples in your own research. So I use this example because it shows how mediatization can change the logic through which cities are governed. However, this research is also dated. This research focused on the year 2005. At the time, social media were in their infancy. We used email and browsed the internet, but we weren't using Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. So this meant that the media in this period basically meant mass media. All the people in this story relied on mass media to communicate to distant audiences. To be sure, the mass media are still a very important vehicle for communicating messages. However, social media have dramatically changed the mediascape. So in the remainder of this presentation, I want to explore the interface of social media and the city. For many of you in the audience, social media have been a self-evident part of your teenage and adult life. Like fish, you may not be aware of the sea in which you swim. Unless, of course, you forget your smartphone or lose your internet connection and maybe feel like a fish out of water. But it is important to stress just how recent and how massive this development has been. Let me take YouTube as an example. YouTube was created in 2005. In July 2006, just before Google bought the service, YouTube announced that more than 56,000 new videos were being uploaded every day, and that the site was receiving 100 million video views per day. So this was 2005. YouTube has seen spectacular growth since that time. The number of hours people are watching on YouTube is up 50% year over year. Today, 300 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. And every day, people watch hundreds of millions of hours on YouTube and generate billions of views every day. Billions of views per day. That's massive. Young adults, the age group between 18 and 34, watch more YouTube than cable television. So the ascendance of social media is routinely characterized as a disruption of the status quo. Every occupation or protest now has a hashtag. The omnipresence of social media increases the cost of keeping information secret, and it lowers the thresholds for mobilization. Their revolutionary potential is also a reason I came to social media in the first place. So I want to spend some time discussing how social media stimulate protest and can catalyze social change. No one has written more powerfully on the communication revolution than Manuel Castells, who has been working on the intersection of communication science, geography, sociology, and urban studies. He argues that we've been moving away from a media landscape dominated by mass media and are moving towards what he refers to as mass self-communication, which he describes as follows. Mass self-communication is self-generated in content, self-directed in emission, and self-selected in reception by many that communicate with the many. Castells goes on to argue that these changes tilt the balance in favor of rebels. The emergence of self-communication offers an extraordinary medium for social movements and rebellious individuals to build their autonomy and confront the institutions of society in their own terms and around their own projects. While the massiveness of the communication revolution currently underway seems unprecedented, there are historical precursors. Consider, for instance, photography, which has been diffusing widely since the 1930s. Nevertheless, the power to register the city remained by and large in the hands of elites. So when Henri Lefebvre was writing The Production of Space, he basically equated representations of space with representations by elites. So the hypothesis I want to explore in this part of the talk is that the diffusion of media serves to disrupt established relations of power. I first want to examine how mobile technologies enable people to record and frame the world from their perspective. Then I want to look at mobilizations of social movements and their geographies. One rather prosaic example is that the wide diffusion of motion cameras has provided a crucial tool for people speaking out against police violence. So we first had a taste of what this means when someone recorded the brutal beating of Rodney King at the hands of officers from the LA Police Department. The recording of the beating and the subsequent failure to convict the police triggered massive riots in 1992. Since that time, recording devices have become smaller, better, and cheaper. Recent months and years have seen the proliferation of recordings of confrontations between police and mostly black suspects, both in the United States and also in the Netherlands. For example, vigilant observers and their cameras made us witness to Eric Gardner's death at the hands of the New York police. After being apprehended on the suspicion of selling cigarettes, he is choked to death as he repeatedly exclaims, "I can't breathe." So time and time again, the clips recorded by witnesses contradict the testimonies of authorities. These types of images allow protesters, critics, and witnesses to break out of local confines and share what they experienced with distant audiences. And what typically ensues in the aftermath of these killings is essentially a battle over representations, with each side of the conflict circulating images supporting their claims. So for instance, after a police officer shot Michael Brown dead in Ferguson, supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement spread a picture of him donning the academic attire he wore during his high school graduation ceremony, while opponents of the movement used an image in which they claimed he is making gang signs. The battles over representations in this instance exemplify a broader pattern of mediatized politics, with different sides of a conflict circulating images in support of their view. Black Lives Matter is one among several recent movements that combine online activism with direct actions on the ground. So here's Alicia Garcia, one of the originators of the Black Lives Matter movement. She explains that Black Lives Matter was an attempt for us to rehumanize us in a world that so profoundly dehumanizes us, and it was a call to action. We were able to build connections online so that people can take action together offline. So in this context, social media are not just a channel of communication for spreading information, they are also a vehicle for mobilizations. On the interface between cities and social media, we see new models of organizing emerging that draw upon older social movements, yet also attempt to move beyond them. So Black Lives Matter is one example of what I would call open source activism. Activists can use the hashtag and talking points of Black Lives Matter at will. It is a sort of general toolbox that they can appropriate in their specific localities. The movement emerges as people in different places connect to each other through hashtags and other symbolism. There's no director, there's no leader. Black Lives Matter self-consciously draws upon the American civil rights movement, but it also emphasizes how it is different in terms of organizational philosophy. The civil rights movement revolved around charismatic male leaders, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. Black Lives Matter seeks to craft a movement that does not center on a leader. Black Lives Matter is not coordinated by any particular organization and does not have one charismatic leader. As Zeynep Tufekci notes, the desire for ad hoc, leaderless, participatory and horizontalist styles of organization is not new. Movements have been having this desire throughout history. However, technology has brought a new dimension to protesters' desires for horizontalism by allowing ad hoc organizing to address collaborative needs in unprecedented fashion. So in the words of Alicia Garcia, whom I just cited, the movement aims to be full of leaders, not leaderless. Rather than rallying around one charismatic male leader who speaks on the movement's behalf, there's a sense among movement participants that many voices should be heard, especially the voices of historically marginalized groups like women or lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders. So what we are seeing here is a reconfiguration of how protest works. As protesters use different media and modalities, I think researchers should do too. I'm not arguing that traditional methods like interviews or newspaper analyses have become redundant, but it does seem to me that we need to expand our concepts and our methods to grasp the network nature of these social movements. So I want to give some attempts in this direction. Together with colleagues at the University of Amsterdam, I'm currently researching the emergence and extension of movements across space in various mobilizations. This is also the topic of a forthcoming book I wrote with Walter Nichols that compares how social movements develop in the United States, France, and the Netherlands. And in that book, we basically argue that you can explain how and why movements develop by looking where they develop. So in essence, we try to use geography to answer questions that have mostly preoccupied sociologists. So let us look a bit in one open source campaign we discuss in the book, namely Not One More. Not One More is a hashtag used by immigrant rights activists in the United States to demand a moratorium on deportations of undocumented immigrants. While mainstream NGOs in Washington considered Obama as their ally in the White House, radical organizations in Los Angeles identified him as the main culprit of the deportations. They specifically targeted President Obama and started referring to him as the deporter-in-chief. So this is an early poster that mobilized people to protest at an event in Los Angeles where Obama would speak. As you can see, it already mentions the Not One More hashtag. So we are looking at this campaign in some detail because we think it can teach us about the dynamics of protest. Interestingly, this campaign was set up explicitly as an open source campaign. So Mariso Franco, one of the organizers of the campaign, explains, open source comes from coding and programming circles. Instead of building everything in-house and in secret, open source refers to something whose design is public, a central platform that invites modification and improvement through various entry points of collaboration. Think Linux versus Windows, Firefox versus Internet Explorer. In campaign terms, it manifests a little differently. What makes them open source is not the platform they use, but the way participation is designed. Whereas there's still a hub and a core development team, participants have the ability to see code and alter it to improve it. So we wanted to see more about how this plays out, and therefore we looked how this campaign evolved on Twitter. So this slide introduces the basics of our research. We basically scraped all the tweets using the hashtag. Since using a hashtag requires no high levels of trust or strong ties, one might expect that there is no distinct geography to this movement. But in fact, there is. This map shows where the tweets originated in the first months of the campaign. Users concentrate strongly in certain urban areas, in particular Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, and New York. As the campaign progresses, we see the geographical diffusion of protest, with more rural and suburban areas also adopting the hashtag. To map how protesters establish connections through social media, Sander van Haperen built an interface that tracks Twitter traffic through time. So this is a screenshot of the interface tracking the Not One More campaign. Using these types of methods, we can uncover the geographical underpinnings of the campaign. As I mentioned, this campaign originated in Los Angeles, and this city is one of the major nodes in the network. It is the most important node. But we find that these activists in Los Angeles established ties across the United States with activists in other cities. Together, they form a hub among cities. And this is, you might say, the backbone of the movement. And this backbone stays intact throughout the campaign. So Los Angeles and New York, in the earliest months of the campaign, concentrated 23% of traffic. And after 12 months, that had increased to 29%. So these cities and the other cities involved, they remain important throughout the campaign. But the campaign also featured direct actions in more peripheral areas. We are currently compiling a list of these direct actions, but let me just discuss one example to illustrate the sort of dynamics we're talking about. So this is a deportation facility in Phoenix, Arizona. This group of people was having a vigil outside the deportation facility when a bus comes out. The vigil then turns into a blockade. And here you see how this happened. They start standing around the bus, in front of the bus. They pray. They sing. Somebody inside. 2 people arrested. But nevertheless, the protest goes on, and in the end, the bus returns to the deportation center. So you see these types of activities taking place all over, and you might say that these people latch on to the backbone of the movement. So I think we can speak of a network anatomy of this type of open source activism, where 3 mechanisms are involved. First, there's concentration in the major urban hubs. This is where most of the organizers work. This is where most of the activists live. The people within these urban hubs originate and coordinate the campaigns. They drive the campaign. They also have strong connections to each other. So they constantly communicate, what are you doing in Los Angeles? What are you doing in New York? Then second, there are direct actions on the periphery. These direct actions require strong ties and high levels of trust among activists. It takes quite some trust to stand there together in front of the bus, to be arrested, to nevertheless persist in your activism. So these are local groups of people who come together and join the movement as a group. And then third, we see that there are national events that draw attention and new recruits to the campaign. And these people are scattered throughout the United States. And typically, their involvement with the campaign, as measured through their use of the hashtag, is short-lived and ephemeral. So we thus see how the movement evolves geographically in uneven ways over time. So I want to explore 2 other mobilizations to further deepen our understanding of the geography. And here I want to show a small clip. So what we're seeing here is the geography of the Spanish Indignados movement that took to the streets and the squares in protest against austerity politics. Borge Holthoefer et al.'s research on Twitter activity in the run-up to the 15 May street demonstrations helps to grasp how this movement emerged. Manuel Castells has extensively discussed the interaction between offline and online urban protest spaces. In both types of spaces, online as well as urban, movements can form if they achieve some distance from the state and autonomously build networks. And these are some of the networks they built. So as this clearly shows, Twitter activity is not insensitive to geography, but follows a very clear pattern, with the superhub Madrid as the movement's epicenter. And just to emphasize, the patterns we see here were obtained exclusively from Twitter data. And yet, these Twitter communities are geographically defined. After they aggregated all the network data and performed analyses, this is what the authors concluded. That's quite an awesome clip, eh? They're computer scientists and physicists, so we can never do this, but at least we can show it. So, here are their conclusions. The fact that communities are geographically defined suggests some additional conclusions. First, the mesoscale reflects the autonomy of each of the assemblies throughout the Spanish geography. Each of these modules hardly connects to any other, indicating a low communication between them. In other words, people on the squares in Spain mostly tweet to the person right next to them. The exception to this previous point is Madrid. Each minor camp holds a strong communication interchange with the movement represented by Acambato Sol. This is the hub in Madrid. So interestingly, these people mostly communicate to each other and to Madrid. This is where they get their inspiration from. This is what they communicate to. So the overall conclusion is that despite the potential of Web 2.0 communication platforms, data indicates that these media are mostly used to communicate with geographically close people. In other words, the network is global, but communication is mainly local. So I think that these are very interesting conclusions that I suspect also apply to other forms of open source activism. So these conclusions, I would say, demonstrate the ongoing relevance of locality and therefore also the ongoing relevance of geography, fortunately for you guys. So finally, as an example of the role of localities within open source activism, I want to look at the Gassy protests that swept Istanbul and many other places in 2013. Let me show just how local this global movement was, if we look at the geography. So here we see it from far away, and then as we zoom in, it becomes more and more apparent that Istanbul is at the very center, and within Istanbul, Taksim and Gazi Park are at the very center. So what accounts for this pattern? How is it that small localities are so important even when digital technologies enable people to traverse distances without any costs? There is something very important to the most local of spaces in the most global of movements. It is in and through these spaces that movements constitute themselves. And this is particularly true of movements created through occupation, movements like the one on Gazi Park. In these cases, people do not join movements as if they are a club, but rather they enact the movement, as they see their collective creation unfold before their eyes. So this is an intense emotional experience that Durkheim refers to as collective effervescence. Being in the same place, body to body, and experiencing history in the making transforms emotions. Feelings of anxiety, frustration, and insecurity are transformed into feelings of excitement, hope, and confidence. Being present in the locality is certainly not a prerequisite to feel these sorts of things. Distant audiences, including some people close to me in the Netherlands, experienced an incredible emotional boost. But these people too focus their attention on this very small space in Istanbul and wish they could be there on Taksim. This small urban space is not only crucial for generating emotional transformations, but it is also culturally and politically generative. It is in this local place that the diverse constituents of the movements come together and negotiate their differences and produce something new altogether. That new thing is the Gassy movement, or as it is now often called, the Gassy Spirit, which in turn is constituted through slogans, symbols, and sentiments. So one example is an iconic picture showing riot police tear gassing a woman from close by. It was also in and through the square that other divisions in Turkish society were overcome. Between Kurds and CHP Republicans, intellectuals and street sellers, the orthodox left, and lesbian, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders. The signs and symbols on this statue speak to the differences that came together on Taksim and that were transcended or at least bracketed in those momentous moments after the square was occupied. So the statue is covered with flags from the Republican CHP, various radical left radical groups, different types of labor unions. There's also a rainbow flag carried by homosexuals and other sexual minorities, and there are Kurdish flags. Now, if you know a little bit about Turkish society, you know that this is a rather special sight. New labels emerged as protesters identified as part of the Gazi movement, or in an ironic twist, adopted as Erdogan's insult, kapulcu, which roughly translates as rioters. That would be the new label for their movement. Taksim thus functioned as an incubator of new subjectivities and new slogans. But what happened in Taksim, of course, did not stay there. Through social media and other channels, discourses and repertoires traveled across the country and across the world, creating a lasting impact. So these examples suggest that directing our attention to the local level can help us to understand how protesters transform one another through their participation in the movement they collectively create. So it is very telling that in today's hyper-connected world, locality is so significant. It is in fact so significant that we even label movements according to their use of space. This is true for Occupy, and it is also true for the Gassy movement. So I hope to have shown how a geographically sensitive perspective aids our understanding of how these movements evolve. My approach has been to examine ethnographically how political subjectivities are created through interactions within cities, and to use network analysis to examine how activists construct networks across space. In this understanding, movements are complex expressions emerging from local interactions. Cities are then crucial sites for the mechanism through which movements form, disband, transform, or fail to form in the first place. And by zooming in on these localities, we can show some of the relational mechanisms through which grievances are created, articulated, relayed, and ultimately broadcasted to the public at large. So my own interest is in social movements, and therefore I presented on social movements. But I would say that a similar approach could be used to study almost any other topic. Economic innovation, for instance, also typically concentrates in certain urban places where intense and creative interactions take place, and this economic innovation then extends across space. Developments in music, painting, or fashion also show similar patterns. In all these cases, we can better understand how and why developments occur by studying where they occur. So far, I've shown how protesters use social media to organize against border enforcement or neoliberalism. So these examples clearly confirm Castell's argument that social media offer a particularly fertile environment for those who seek to challenge the status quo. However, I should acknowledge that I have been sampling on the dependent variable by only looking at instances of protest. So this does not teach us much about how social media users navigate and experience the city in their everyday life. How do people view the city through social media? What kind of relations do people develop to each other and to the city? To answer these questions, I've been doing research on Instagram with John Boy, another colleague at the University of Amsterdam. So Instagram, as most of you will know, is primarily a platform for sharing images, mostly photos. Photographing is another one of those media practices that have seen explosive growth year after year. According to figures cited by Nicholas Meershoef, as early as 1930, an estimated 1 billion photographs were being taken every year worldwide. So that's 1930, 1 billion. In 1980, that number had grown to 25 billion. By 2012, 380 billion photos were taken every year. And we reached the threshold of 1 trillion photos in the year 2014. So as people view, take and circulate photographs, they also reconfigure their relations to each other and to the city. And Instagram is one important platform to gauge these relations. So this slide outlines the basics of our research so far. We've been doing interviews with Instagram users, and we've been looking at all Instagram posts that are geotagged as being in Amsterdam. This is roughly 25% of all Instagram posts that are done in Amsterdam. We filtered out tourists because we were interested in everyday life, and we ended up with around 30,000 regular Instagram users. So in addition to interviews, we also obviously did casual observation and participant observation. I can no longer enter into a bar and not type the hashtags on my phone. And we adopted a relational approach. And I would argue that if you want to study social media, then a relational approach is especially opportune. In part because social media are intrinsically networked. In the case of Instagram, users establish relations by following updates, liking posts, or leaving comments. And these mundane practices weave patterns of uneven relations, investing recognition in some people and places and not in others. So, for those of you not familiar with Instagram, this is a very typical picture. People celebrate the beginning of the weekend. They have a toast. And I should point out that they tag the location of the post. And this is something that is very typical of Instagram. It is a medium that is very sensitive to geography. These are the locations of the posts. And for those of you who know Amsterdam a little, you will see that the historical parts and the rich parts of the city are overrepresented. So this is already a first indication that Instagram is selective and uneven in some sorts of ways. Now, some typical Instagram photos, just to give you a flavor of what people do. This is someone who had lunch in her neighborhood, so she's going to get kebab and she's dressing for it and she's sharing that with her friends. This is what a study day looks like on Instagram. Very aesthetic. This is what food looks like on Instagram, and you see a lot of food pictures. You also see many coffee cups on Instagram as people share their locations and share their appetite for coffee. You also see many pictures like this. This picture received hundreds and hundreds of likes. She explains in the comments that she's watching the champagne that was coming. So what does Instagram do to people and to people's relation with the city? First of all, Instagram is a filtering device. So technically it's possible to constantly upload pictures into social media and into Instagram, but this is not what people do. They're intrinsically selective. So you might say that Instagram functions as a membrane that filters images and thoughts. Only some are recorded and circulated, most are not. And users are, by necessity, highly selective in what they communicate. So this is a quote from one of our interviews, somebody who's using Instagram, and she says, you can just scroll and you're looking at it and like, pretty! And all the pictures are always very happy. Everybody is so healthy. And that is indeed the impression you get as you browse through Instagram photos. So here we see a typical happy group photo, and this is a photo shoot at the swimming pool. This is a post by one of the most central users in Amsterdam. She posted good vibes only, which applies well to Instagram, I think. And interestingly, people like Instagram for the sort of happy vibes it filters out. But they also get a little bit unrestful in various ways. So this is, again, this is a central user who talks about her experience with Instagram. She explains, last night it was so warm and I couldn't sleep at all. So I just put a chair in front of the window, opened the window and thought I'd read a book. So I was reading the book and every 2 pages I was like, I wanted to grab my phone. This is not normal. I just put my phone away in the other room. Okay, I just want to read right now. But the constant is just in your head all the time. You just want to grab it. It's ridiculous. Because we do it all day long and you share all day long. So this is an experience some of you may be familiar with when you're trying to read a book. I think 2 pages is quite a lot, to be honest, in some cases. And these are posts by that particular user. That particular user is a city marketeer, but she also has a private account on Instagram, and you see the personal and the professional all the time going over into one another. So these are just 9 posts, all carefully staged, all nice places in Amsterdam. So here's somebody else, again a very central user, and she really navigates the city looking for places that she can put on Instagram. So she talks about it like this. I see a new place opening because it's just something I notice. I see everything. My doctor says it has something to do with my ADHD. That I look at everything. I'm kind of obsessed with my surroundings, so that's where my focus goes. So she was very happy to be among the first to picture this new place, Cotton Cake, and she did so with a smoothie. Another side you will often see on Instagram. This is another place. It's a place for high-end furniture, and she was also among the first to picture that. So Instagram is a filtering device. It makes people look at the city in a particular way. They look for glamorous things, they look for hip things, they look for high-end things, and they try to picture themselves with those things. Instagram is also a stratification device. So if you look at how people connect to each other on Instagram, if you examine the relationships they form through their likes and comments, and then plot it, you see this, an extremely uneven distribution. Some people receive many likes and comments, other people hardly any. And there are a few people who really stand out. So this is the distribution for Amsterdam as a whole, and we replicated this analysis for 22 neighborhoods in Amsterdam, and to our surprise, we found the exact distribution in all those neighborhoods. So apparently, this is kind of the signature distribution of Instagram. Very uneven. And this unevenness is among users, but it's also among places. So there are some places that are tagged very often. The most tagged place in Amsterdam is Vondelpark, a public park, which is maybe interesting. And then there are many places like this. This is a place that is tagged very often. It's in my neighborhood.
You were the one tagging?
No, I didn't do the tagging. No, I don't want to interfere with my research object. So Instagram, lastly, is also a segmentation device. As people connect to each other, they look for people they like and people they are like. So then, using these networks that you can infer based on likes and comments, you can also do community detection. You can see how people cluster together. And then we ended up with 7 rather big communities. I won't go into all of them in detail, but I do want to share some findings. So this is how this looks in a neighborhood. You see different communities, they cluster together with some users being more central than others. You can also map this onto real space, and then you see that different communities also cluster in space, although they don't concentrate heavily. So these communities are generally not geographically defined in the sense that they concentrate in particular neighborhoods, but they do concentrate in particular places. So these are 3 of the communities. The first I would like to refer to as the vanguard of lifestyle promoters. The most central users in these communities write fashion blogs, lifestyle blogs. They go to parties, they organize parties, they're very fashionable. The second community consists of locally oriented gentrifiers. So these are people who all the time picture their food when they go to a restaurant, they picture their beer. And finally, there's a cluster that I refer to as urban. These people are concerned with hip-hop, with music, and so on. Now, I would like to draw your attention to this column, which is referred to spatial embeddedness. It's the percentage of posts that have a place tagged in them. And this is kind of the information we have, and we're not sure what tagging a place means. Based on our interviews, we think that people tag places when they're proud of being in those places, when they identify with those places. So in that sense, a place tag tells us something about the extent to which people can symbolically claim their space in the city. So here we might have data on inequalities with respect to the way in which the city offers points of identification. And we expect these inequalities because typically it costs money to go to a very hip and glamorous place. So we expect richer groups to take more places than poorer groups. And we also expect people who are with many to have more places than people who are with a few. So we tested this. And this is to give you an impression of the first community. You would see pictures like this, if I may say so, beautiful women drinking together. She works as a consultant to advise people how to influence others, but she also doubles as a DJ. So that is what we see here, and these pictures were all very often liked and shared. So this community has quite a few places they take, and these places, these all tend to be very high-end and glamorous. They're typically also new places that were created as part of an ongoing process of gentrification. And as you may have guessed by now, that process of gentrification is in essence a class process. Basically, you have middle and higher classes replacing lower classes. But it is also a thoroughly gendered process. So we see that women, and particularly young women, are overrepresented among the gentrifiers in Amsterdam, and Instagram is one vehicle through which they assign meaning to the city. And this is how they document their experiences and symbolically claim their space in the city. So this is where that cluster 1 concentrates. A very heavy concentration in the historical core of the city and in Amsterdam South, which is the richest area of the city. So clearly this is a very privileged cluster. Now look at another cluster, the urban cluster. As I said, this cluster consists of people who are into hip-hop, into sports also to some extent. There are many people of color, not all, and we see that they wear outfits made by local designers. So Pata is a local designer brand, and you see that over and over again in these sorts of pictures. Then if you look at the places they tag, one thing that stands out is they tag very, very few places. Now our assumption so far is that this is because they don't have many places in the city that they can go to and feel proud of. Obviously they are in places as often as any other person, so that cannot be the difference. The difference has something to do with their propensity or their capacity to symbolically identify with places. And this is one of the few places they do identify with, which is the Global Dance Center in Amsterdam Southeast. And this is their distribution across the city. There is a concentration in Amsterdam Southeast, but it would be an oversimplification to say that it is an Amsterdam Southeast cluster, because they do post all over Amsterdam. So what can we conclude? Any conclusion has to be preliminary, obviously, but here's my hunch so far. First, Instagram cultivates what we might refer to as a neoliberal subjectivity. A neoliberal subjectivity because people all the time emphasize that they are healthy, productive, successful, and there's hardly any place for criticism or conflict. There's not any place even for negativity. So this gives a very different image than the cases I presented earlier. So it is neoliberal subjectivity. I would argue that Instagram cultivates this, that people also feel pressured to become successful, healthy, and to abstain from criticism. But it is neoliberal subjectivity with a charming twist. Because as it goes, as you are studying these pictures and you look through their timelines, then you start liking these people. And then you also notice that they only tag places that are distinctly local, so they never tag chains. They really emphasize the authentic Amsterdam, they emphasize artisan production, so this is the charming twist. I think the major mechanism on Instagram is what we call recursive elevation. People tag places and picture themselves in places because they want to elevate their status. They want to show, look at me, I'm eating this very nice food in this very nice place, and in doing so they elevate their status. But they also elevate in the process the status of those places, lifting them out and distinguishing them from other places in the city. And it does seem that different groups have this capacity at elevation to very different extent. So people apparently have different ways and different degrees of claiming space, and there seem to be marked inequalities in the way that people can claim space and claim a part of their city. Now, one more conceptual question is, if there is no negativity, if there is no conflict, how can you start to conceptualize distinction, domination, subversion on a medium like Instagram? I'm just asking that question. I wish I had all the answers, but this research is ongoing. So now, my general conclusions. While people's experiences of place have always been shaped by communication, I would argue that the proliferation of media technologies has provided users with the capacity to instantly share their impressions and images with distant audiences. City dwellers increasingly perceive and navigate the city through smartphone applications, and wittingly and unwittingly leave traces of data that in turn serve as input to decisions of others. The proliferation of media technologies wraps an amalgam of communication systems around the city. This process does not negate reality. Mediatization also does not usurp reality in its totality. So I wouldn't say that cities are now subjected to a singular media logic. Mediatization does, however, warp reality through selective and strategic representation. In the words of Susan Sontag, the notion of reality is weakened and complicated as it is multiplicated in representations. And my aim has therefore been to unravel some of the layers of communication that form the interface through which we connect to each other and to the city. So in conclusion, I'll outline some of the broader, more theoretical implications. I think generally geographers, urbanists, tend to continue to think of the city in material terms, as places on a map. A number of geographers, notably Doreen Massey, have tried to move away from this understanding by conceptualizing the city as the manifestation of extended relations and networks. Similarly, the recent wave of theorizing on planetary urbanism usefully destabilizes the notion of the city. I think we can extend this theorizing by considering that cities are constructed not just through flows of people or material connections, but also through images. So when protesters exclaim that Gassy is everywhere, we should think through the implications. Our experiences of places are not just constructed in those places, but through their representations. And these representations extend as far as channels of communication do. So while my emphasis has been on complicating the notion of cities, I would not want to succumb to the idea that cities are endlessly plural and complex, and that our task is simply to document the multifaceted representations of cities. To the contrary, one of the tasks at hand is exactly to identify the logic through which cities are construed through representations. For instance, David Harvey's The Condition of Postmodernity convincingly argues that the experience of ephemerality, multiplicity and fragmentation is conditioned by the logic of post-Fordist capitalism. Similarly, recent work on stigma highlights how the sustained and systemic symbolic degradation of people and places paves the way for draconic interventions. So such general theorizing helps us to think beyond the scattered and fragmented images and consider the general logics underlying representations. And only by grounding our research in such general theorizing can we hope to navigate the rapidly changing landscape that is construed in the offline interface. Finally, we might also have to consider the way we do research. As I have discussed under the rubric of open source activism, social movements have reinvented themselves as they adopt different methods and philosophies of organizing. I think science is just beginning to do this. So researchers like Christian Breuer are now experimenting with crowd-based and crowdsourced research, which is pretty exciting. In any case, if we acknowledge that the city is not just an offline place but extends into online spaces, then we have to understand how these online spaces work. Just as social life is extending into online spaces, so geographers must do. So do the geography of online spaces. There is already some interesting work out there, but one of the stimulating and also disorienting aspects of working on this interface is that we're really trying to grasp a moving target. So in this presentation, I've been offering glimpses into the research and thinking that I'm doing, and I would want to invite you to think through how these issues are reflected in your research. Thank you very much for your attention.